Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode number 18. So to recap on the last episode, we basically started off a discussion about James Kent's final 10 DoseNation podcast series, where we are analysing James Kent's various attitudes towards popular psychedelic discourse. And we identified a number of important points, important differences between James Kent's approach to pop psych versus our own. There's some things we agree with him about and some things that we disagree with him about. But it's interesting to identify the core principles behind his attitude towards pop psychedelia.
We're both critical of pop psychedelia in certain ways, and so I think that's part of our goal here, is to compare and contrast and describe what we think is strong there in his critique and what is lacking in it, and what we think we can provide.
Right, yeah, definitely. Because actually critiques or, critical voices directed at popular psychedelia is actually fairly rare. There's only a really tiny number. It's really James Kent, Jan Irvin, and us, as far as I know, in terms of well-argued, structured critique aimed at pop psych. So it's important to analyse this and see exactly what his angle is. So we're going to continue that discussion now. We're going to talk about the third episode of the DoseNation Final 10 podcast series. And it was clear from the last episode that this particular one made a particular impression on both of us. We were both struck by just how strongly he attacks Albert Hofmann. It's like a character assassination of Albert Hofmann, the inventor of LSD, on the basis of his motivations and what he wrote about when he became a psychedelic publisher later in life after his discovery of LSD. So to start off episode 3 of the final 10, he makes a few important relevant points about psychosis and bad trips and ego death. So for example, he says he equates psychosis to uncontrollable thoughts, which is an important link between his thinking and the Egodeath Theory, like the concept of loss of control, and loss of control being the central characteristic of the psychotic, panic attack, bad trip kind of experience. He starts to talk about ego death in the sense of the fact that people, when they trip, commonly think to themselves that they have died. And he traces back the history of that. And he makes the very interesting point, very controversial point, that the LSD experience is like dying because it has already been suggested by people like Tim Leary that it's like dying. So he says that because Tim Leary came out with the Tibetan Book of the Dead translation, where he was explicitly making the connection between the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the psychedelic ego death experience. In other words, he's decoding metaphor, because on the face of it, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is meant to be a guide for dying in the physical bodily sense. And what Tim Leary, the idea Tim Leary had, was to view it as metaphor and say that actually it's a guide to the LSD trip. And what James Kent is saying here is that people experience dying in an LSD trip because they already have the idea of Tim Leary in their mind talking about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is an interesting idea. It's difficult to justify such an idea because you have to ask, where did the death experience come from in the first place before Tim Leary wrote that book? Why did Tim Leary have the idea to write the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a guide to psychedelic ego death? And James Kent kind of acknowledges that for brief flashes, but on the whole, he ignores that and pretends as if Tim Leary was the first person who ever had that thought about dying in the psychedelic experience, and then everybody else was just following from Tim Leary's example.
I mean, Kent also relatedly acts as though that idea of dying wouldn't occur to anyone unless it was already suggested by someone else. It's kind of an extreme idea of set and setting will control the experience or thoroughly shape the experience. That no one would ever think that taking LSD would result in a sensation of dying unless it had been suggested to them in advance or planted in them in advance by someone else in culture or some other form of cultural production. It only comes from that and not from anything else. I think he doesn't state that explicitly, but it comes through, I think, in some of what he says.
I think this is connected to an issue that we identified in the last episode where we talked about his sheer blindness towards mystic state phenomenology. It's as if he thoroughly diminishes the importance of the actual phenomenology itself, the actual content of the altered state experience. So what he's saying here is it couldn't possibly be the acid trip itself that gives people this overwhelming feeling of being dead. Rather, it comes from a kind of narrative history that's been handed down to them.
Mm-hmm.
Then he does talk about how the psychotic bad trip, panic attack style experience is more memorable than the more pleasant psychedelic experiences because of the sheer adrenaline and the panic. It becomes a memorable experience. And I think, again, this relates to a kind of tension within James Kent's own mind that you pointed out in the last episode, where he wants a psychedelic trip that doesn't affect your life in any way. He's uncomfortable with the idea of a life-transforming or a life-transforming psychedelic experience. He doesn't want that to exist, even though he fully acknowledges that the whole basis of this podcast series and his entire career as a psychedelic journalist stemmed from a psychotic panic attack experience that he himself had. And he's now going to go on to talk about Albert Hofmann, who, in a perfect analog of his own, the shape of his own career trajectory, Albert Hofmann too had a life-changing acid freakout, panic attack experience right at the start of his career, when he first discovered LSD and took it by accident. The experience that he then had was very clearly, very definitively a panic attack style experience. It wasn't pleasant, which then transformed Albert Hofmann's life and led his life and his career down a completely new pathway. So, there's that very common pattern of having a psychedelic freakout experience and then embarking on a new phase of life. And both James Kent and Albert Hofmann have both exemplified that shape of a lifetime.
Now, that's interesting. That does often happen. We can talk about this when we get to the details later. I interpreted or sensed that there's a lot more projection going on. I didn't find it very Kent's framing that Albert Hofmann had a bad trip and then changed his life to be very convincing in the same way, in the way that James Kent frames it.
How do you mean?
Well, this is perhaps skipping forward slightly, but Kent frames it as that Albert Hofmann gave up his passion, I think he uses that word, his passion for chemistry, and switched to being interested in visionary plants and shamanic uses of plants, and that was because he was trying to figure out what happened to him in that bad trip. And Kent seems to imply that there is no other reason that Albert Hofmann would have changed his life in a certain way, or become interested in the use of plants in human culture, the use of visionary plants in human culture, that is solely caused by having this horror trip, as Hofmann uses the term. And this seemed bizarre to me, to think that the chemist, discoverer of or synthesizer of LSD and of psilocybin would Kent treats it as a far-fetched, bizarre idea that this person would become interested in other visionary plants around the world and in their use in human culture. And I found that hard to hard to believe. That doesn't seem that odd of a leap. It's not as if he gave up chemistry to become a astronaut or something very far afield like that. And I began to suspect, I mean, as you pointed out, that Kent exemplifies himself. He describes himself quite clearly in this third episode and throughout as changing his life after he had his own horror trip. That's the term that Albert Hofmann uses, and Kent describes it here, a horror trip, and to figure out what happened to him. That's what Kent says that he was motivated by. He was motivated by trying to figure out what happened to him in this horror trip, and so he changed his life and became a journalist of psychedelics and a researcher into psychedelic neuroscience. And I read that as a certain amount of projection onto Albert Hofmann. I don't think it really fits in the same way with Albert Hofmann. We don't really know what his reaction to that horror trip was, but it seems odd to pin an interest in visionary plants and their uses in human culture. It doesn't seem that far-fetched or weird to me for Albert Hofmann to become interested in those things. It's more that this whole narrative that Kent has constructed doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The causal reason doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so I see that as much more of Kent projecting onto Albert Hofmann his own life story, which I think has several. I think that I have a reason for that. I think we should get into it later. I have a suspicion, a speculation. But
I see. Interesting. Yeah, so this is something that we'll get to in a minute in more detail about how he analyzes and characterizes Albert Hofmann's motivations.
Yeah, I think that Hofmann's motivations are a little more understandable as presented in his book, LSD, My Problem Child, than Kent's desire to make them all be caused by that one horror trip that is described in the book. I don't see the causal relation that Kent wants to create. Kent wants there to be a causal relation between a bad trip and changing one's life in bizarre ways. This is part of his way of putting down tripping, or putting down thinking that a trip is significant.
I see what you mean. I hadn't spotted that particular idea, but that's very strange given that it's obviously not right, because in Albert Hofmann's case, it wasn't just the fact that he had one bad trip. It was the fact that he had discovered this new chemical that then millions of other people went on to take, and it affected the world in a particular way. And that was what it was the whole dense tapestry of different things that happened after the discovery of LSD that caused Albert Hofmann to start to research and think in the way that he did, rather than just one trip. So yeah, I think so I see what you mean. Kent is definitely projecting his own life onto Albert Hofmann's a bit artificially, a bit too much in that instance. But it really struck me the major issue in this podcast, in this episode 3, which we also talked about when we covered episodes 1 and 2, is what Michael Hofmann refers to as the unpleasant equals unmystical fallacy. So on egodeath.com, it's in the page entheogen diminishment fallacies. One of them is the idea of unpleasant equals unmystical. If a trip is not glorious, hallelujah, blissful, really pleasant, easy, orgasmic, joyful, that kind of thing, if it's actually terrifying, nightmarish, psychotic, hellish, if you would use those kinds of words to describe it, then it can't also be mystical, religious, and transcendent. And I did actually spot one glaring inconsistency in Kent's employment of the unpleasant equals unmystical fallacy, which is he's perfectly happy to allow for unpleasant experiences to be paired with recreational use of a drug, but he absolutely refuses to allow unpleasant experiences to be included as mystical or religious use of a drug. That strikes me as inconsistent reasoning. If Kent is going to say that psychedelics cannot possibly be religious or mystical because they can be unpleasant and psychotic, surely he would have to say that these drugs cannot be recreational because they can also be unpleasant and psychotic. And nobody who is going into a drug-taking session wanting to have, a recreational fun time is going to want to have a bad trip, because that's thoroughly unpleasant, and it's not the kind of fun that you normally seek when you're on that kind of pleasure party idea with taking drugs. And Kent is unusually insistent about it. Right through the course of this episode, he hammers that unpleasant equals unmystical fallacy, as if he's absolutely baffled why Albert Hofmann would have said that not just LSD, but these other visionary plants and chemicals would have religious or mystical significance, given that they are unpleasant. He uses the example of the very first psychedelic trip, LSD trip that Albert Hofmann had when he got on his bicycle and had this famous bike ride home. Now, very clearly, Albert Hofmann is describing that experience as a bad trip. There's no confusion there. There's no room for ambiguity, as far as I've always been able to tell. He said that his neighbor came round to look after him and she looked like a hideous demon, something like that. It's thoroughly unpleasant and terrifying. But Kent says in episode 3 very clearly that he had never thought about it this way before, and it's only suddenly now he seemed to have had a completely fresh take on the whole of psychedelia, the whole of pop psych narrative, the whole of his own career, the whole of the other psychedelic luminaries' careers, like Albert Hofmann. Suddenly, just since he started doing these final 10 episodes, he is claiming he has had a complete new, fresh understanding, but he doesn't say where that came from. It's as if he just had a total change of heart, and including massive errors of interpretation, such as this, where apparently James Kent read LSD My Problem Child many years ago when he was in the thick of his whole psychedelic journalistic career. And for some reason, he saw that trip report, that story about this bicycle ride, as being a pleasant, blissful experience. And now, only suddenly now, recently, has he suddenly realized that actually Albert Hofmann is describing a bad trip, or a horror trip, as he calls it.
It strains credibility. It makes him seem less credible as a reporter.
It's always been perfectly clear from my point of view that the first time that Albert Hofmann took acid, he had a pretty bad trip afterwards. So I don't know how Kent can justify ever having thought differently, given, having actually read the book and having read that description of the experience.
Yes, it's as if it's deliberately one-sided.
It does. Like, he's going just too far in his zeal to stick to this highly tendentious form of narrative, this highly critical and attacking stance to take against pop psychedelia. It does strain credibility. So he's talking mainly about two books that Albert Hofmann wrote, or one book that Albert Hofmann wrote, which is LSD My Problem Child, and another book which Albert Hofmann contributed to among a large number of authors, which is Plants of the Gods, where I think there's Christian Ratch and maybe Gordon Wasson and Jonathan Ott. I forget all the names that were involved in that book, but it was a large number of people doing, proper anthropological fieldwork research, looking for instances of visionary psychedelic plant use in remote cultures, like non-Western cultures throughout the world. And talking about LSD My Problem Child, and the point that James Kent makes very strongly is that Albert Hofmann is always describing these experiences as his own personal LSD experiences as being panic-stricken and bad, negative, unpleasant. Now, I haven't personally read LSD My Problem Child, but that actually surprised me, and I did wonder if that was actually true. Is it actually true that Albert Hofmann never had a good trip, or that he never described having had a good, pleasant experience? That just doesn't seem right from the the reality of any psychedelic user. It's like, sure, there are times when if you use psychedelic drugs many, many times, there are inevitably going to be instances where you experience panic attack and negative feedback and all of those unpleasant phenomena. But that's not going to be every single time you do it. If it was, nobody would ever continue doing psychedelics very much because it would be such a thoroughly unpleasant thing to do. But you can observe that actually recreational use of or party style use of psychedelic drugs is actually very common because people commonly do have good experiences, pleasant experiences.
Well, in fact, he does describe a good trip, one that Kent identifies in Kent's terminology and way of thinking is a good trip, a fun and pleasant trip, which is the description of when Hoffman accidentally dosed himself, and he experienced, yes, before the horror trip that's described. He certainly describes there as having a good, pleasant experience with some fun visualizations and things like that, stuff that Kent thinks is fun. And then he goes on to say, well, the second one is a crisis trip, a psychotic reaction. Kent frames it as the epitome of a psychotic trip.
But then what about subsequent personal experiences that he describes?
Right, I have not read it in detail. I've prompted by Kent. I read the horror trip passage and the last chapter, which we can talk about later. But I haven't studied it in detail to see if he describes other pleasant ones. But it wouldn't surprise me. It would be surprising if Albert Hofmann only ever had horror trips. That seems implausible for any one person.
But that certainly seems to be what Kent is implying. Although he does briefly make the concession during this episode 3 recording that Albert Hofmann in that book, LSD, My Problem Child, does describe other people's experience as being pleasant and what James Kent characterizes as transcendent, transcending the world or mystical type experiences, just not his own. But then that also strikes me as a kind of sleight of hand self-contradiction, because James Kent is making the overall point about psychedelic experiences in general not being transcendent, not being genuinely transcendent or mystical. Not just Albert Hofmann's. So it's not quite clear what the point that he's making is, but he does want to deny that psychedelic drugs can cause valid, legitimate, genuine mystical experiences. So one of the ways that he argues that talking about LSD, My Problem Child, is to say that Albert Hofmann is only describing negative experiences, and therefore how on earth can he possibly make the connection to religion, religious practices, mysticism, that kind of thing? Again, it's like Kent really wants to hammer home the point that he personally cannot understand for 1 second why anybody would want to connect psychedelia with religion. And he makes very little reference to psychedelic phenomenology in order to make this argument.
Because Kent is committed, he's self-professed skeptic and atheist. He is committed to... It's unclear what his definition of religion actually is so far in my listening. He hasn't really defined that. He seems to be obsessed about the question of what is the nature of reality, and he thinks that religion is also trying to describe what is the nature of reality, and Kent compares that against the way that he views materialistic science as describing the nature of reality. And I think that's a contextual framing that is very important, that comes up again and again in his attempts to describe psychedelic religion or psychedelic answers to what religion is and what it's for, what its role is in human culture.
Yes, he's always keen to stress that he personally is a strict rationalist, atheist, scientific materialist, and that axiom is right at the heart of all of his thinking, that he just is going to think about psychedelic experiencing as at base a physical phenomenon in the brain. So I think that feeds into this whole denial of a genuinely religious element to psychedelic experiencing, because he wants to deny that there's anything genuinely religious or mystical in the first place, because that would contradict his basic materialist stance. Precludes him from being able to form a link between psychedelic experiencing and religion in the first place. So I guess he starts off from that point of view, and then he has to fill in the blanks afterwards.
Right. It's like he thinks that religion inevitably means, I believe these are his words in episode 4, an externalizing of agency, and a thought that things experienced in the psychedelic state happen. So I believe his way he may describe psychedelic religion in general as an externalizing of phenomenon that one experiences in the psychedelic state have external reality and agency, and Kent thinks that that's nonsense, that all the things in the psychedelic state happen just within the mind. But his definition of religion is always that it implies an external agency. He doesn't seem to grasp, doesn't seem to grasp the idea or have considered the idea that it's, I personally have no problem saying that all the psychedelic experiences happen within the mind, but I think a core idea, a key idea, a concept here is that there is a hidden place in the mind, a hidden place in the consciousness that we don't have direct access to in the ordinary state, that the altered state opens up.
Well, I think at this point, given that he's talking about external agency, because agency is a cybernetic concept, it would be useful to compare what he's saying in this context to what the Egodeath Theory is saying. So the Egodeath Theory says that in the intense psychedelic experience, it feels as if there is a kind of separate agency of thinking. There's like an ultimate control source which controls absolutely everything, which is it's separate from egoic self-control. I think what James Kent would say, he would take egoic self-control to be real, I guess. But he would then deny that. He would say, so you might have an ego death experience where you perceive as if all of your thoughts and actions are emanating from a timeless, hidden, ultimate control source, but that apparent perception of a hidden control source is hallucinatory. So he's denying the reality of what Michael Hofmann calls controller X. He's saying that if you might experience that kind of thing, that sense of external agency, but that it's not real. Although I think in his sense, he's not really talking about a controller X in that regard. I think he's more talking about other egoic style controllers inside the mind. So it might be something like Terence McKenna's machine elves, or it might be angels or demons or fairies or something like that. He would say that's the kind of thing that people hallucinate when they trip, and it's just a hallucination. I think I'm trying to extend his thinking maybe a bit too far to try to bring it into line, make it comparable to the ego death theory. But it's just when you brought up the subject of agency, that's just that's such an obviously cybernetic principle that it would make sense to do that.
It is. I think that that to expand on this just for a moment, I think part of the goal is to show, not our goal here, but there is a larger goal of showing how atheism can be brought into line with ego death theory. I think that that's part of, and therefore with a version of religion. There is Kent really seems to me to be part of this very 20th century battle between literal religion and literal atheism. And so he very much views religion as making claims about what is the literal nature of reality, and he views that that's actually science's or atheism's realm, and that's what atheism is also about, is about what are literal claims about the nature of reality, and both lacking that strong metaphor or also focus upon what's actually going on in the experiencing. I mean, it's like, regardless of whether there's an external agent who exists somewhere that is controller X, or whatever term we use, that is a very common experience while taking psychedelics. It's a common idea and a felt, very phenomenologically felt experience that is there to be explained. Kant's explanation is to say it's all hallucination, and we should just take small doses of psychedelics in order to avoid panic attack and catastrophic loss of control. The Egodeath Theory says we can go through that experience and get to the other side, so to speak. We can go through that catastrophic loss of control. Here's how to conceive of it. Here's how to do it. Perhaps not safely. I don't even want to inscribe it in terms of safety, but here's an explanation for the for how that works, what the dynamics of that are, what the range of options are, responses. Whereas Kant is really stuck in that literalist religion versus literalist atheist culture war.
So he's really just focusing on the difference between two ontological or metaphysical models of reality, one which is just a physical universe and one which is a physical world with a god as well. And that's all he can really see. And so he's not focusing on the matter at hand, which is the phenomenology of altered state experiencing. He's too concerned with metaphysics, not enough concerned with phenomenology.
Well, there's a moment, to bring us back to episode 3, I think we can tie this in. There's a moment before he starts talking about Albert Hofmann in which he is talking about, he spends a couple minutes on this. He's talking about an early trip he had where he was watching trees wave, and he started to think that maybe the mountain was breathing, and seeing the trees move, well, maybe that's the earth breathing, things of this sort. We're about 14 minutes in to the episode 3, but I thought it was really telling. He claims there he always concluded, he always thought that it was an optical illusion. And I quote, "Never once did I actually believe that I was seeing what I thought I was seeing." So he never took any of these ideas about the mountain breathing seriously. That's what he means to tell us. And I just want to point out there the contrasting ideas of optical illusion to contrast with the word believe. What he's upset about is people believing that what they're seeing, or what they think they're seeing or experiencing, is real and not just a illusion or a hallucination. And that really, I think that contrast, that whole way of framing it right there, shows these two competing scare quotes science versus scare quotes religion, that Ken always thought it was an optical illusion, i.e. science, and never believed, i.e. religion, that the effects were anything else. And that this dichotomy is shot all the way through his thinking and his discussions so far. And from my perspective, having spent a lot of time with the Egodeath Theory, I can see the limitations in this whole debate, this whole framing, as there are these two options. We talked about last time that we think that the Egodeath Theory represents a third option. And I think that's very true in the scare quotes science versus scare quotes religion debate. Both are obsessed with kind of a literalizing. I've already mentioned this, and both fundamentally lack a metaphorical interpretation. That's a key characteristic that Kent is unable and unwilling to apply to the people that he's studying. He takes people's comments about religion at face value. And he says, well, that you can't say that because it violates the nature of reality, as science defines it, as materialistic science defines it. And that is some of what he is upset with Albert Hofmann for. Albert Hofmann was once a scientist, and now how awful he has turned to studying visionary plants. We're supposed to groan and think, what a shame that such a great scientist has now turned to religion.
I can't exactly remember how he concludes that bit about the breathing trees, but doesn't he go on to say something about how so he didn't believe that the trees and the mountains were actually breathing, but then when he had a bad trip, he did, or something that actually changed his. I shouldn't talk about that because I can't exactly remember what it was, but it was just I thought there was a reference to his bad trip right at the end of that section of talking about the mountains and the trees breathing.
Yes, yeah, right. The mountain and the trees breathing is meant to, I think, again, set up how he has never given up his scientific materialism, unlike Albert Hofmann, despite the fact that they both experienced horror trips. And you're right, he does then, according to my notes, he then does describe having how he freaked out, he experienced mania. He describes how he went to the psychedelic community to figure out what happened to him because the books he was reading weren't satisfying to him. And then he begins to discuss Albert Hofmann and horror trips and his frustration with Albert Hofmann, which ultimately stems from his reading of Hoffman's last chapter of LSD, My Problem Child. And personally, I thought Kent was at his worst here. In Albert Hofmann's last chapter of My Problem Child, I reread it, prompted by Kent. Hofmann starts to talk about kind of vaguely philosophical concepts. He talks about the separation of self from nature and the individualized character of modern Western thought and culture, and how this is somehow, promotes a kind of neurosis in psychological neurosis in people's behavior. And Hofmann argues that, well, LSD should be used in kind of neo-Dionysian rites to help people get over that sense of separate selfhood and separation from nature. And he deploys some philosophical terms, mostly from a German intellectual tradition, Albert Hofmann being Swiss.
Yeah, he repeatedly uses the expression European intellectualism as his target here.
Kent does, yes, as if that chapter's idea, you can describe all of those ideas, you can describe all of European intellectualism by those ideas. And perhaps I'm showing my own background too much, having studied a lot of Greek and Roman texts and philosophy and the general history of Western philosophy, but I found Kent's treatment here extremely anti-intellectual. He complains a lot that Hofmann is using philosophical BS, that he's using big words to describe things. That again, this really shook my sense of credibility in Kent, because I thought, well, how am I supposed to take this person seriously as a thinker when he seems to be refusing to engage with the ideas that Hofmann wants to work with. I don't think this puts Hofmann's ideas or framing above criticism, not at all, but he refuses to even work with it and just says, well, it's just all a layer that's been put on top of the psychedelic party experience. He complains about Hofmann using a term entelechy, which I understand is not a term we'd normally use in English that often, but it's in fact rather normal in certain areas of academic philosophy. It's not this bizarre made-up term, which is how Kent treats it. It is a term derived from Aristotle. It is, in fact, I looked it up again after this hearing James Kent talk about, it's in fact incredibly common, again, within the sphere of German philosophy and German intellectual thought. And so this is not... Kent presents it as this bizarre, far-fetched thing for Albert Hofmann to do this, as if Albert Hofmann's starting point should be James Kent's cultural background of 20th century, late 20th century American culture. Well, Albert Hofmann was raised in a quite different intellectual environment in which quoting Nietzsche would not be uncommon at all. And so that's perhaps more of a surface level critique. No, I don't think. I think that there's a matter of being generous to the intellectual context. It's not, it wouldn't be unusual I don't think it's unusual at all for Albert Hofmann to, for example, quote Nietzsche, because this is the thought world that he was working in. Whereas Kent treats it as this bizarre, far-fetched thing to bring in concepts like the relationship of individual with reality or individual with world. And I simply don't think that... I disagree quite a lot with Kent's framing that Albert Hofmann is doing something bizarre and putting a patina over the psychedelic experience. There is, again, we can criticize Albert Hofmann. I don't think he necessarily has the best formulation of ideas in that chapter. My point here is a certain frustration and annoyance with Kent as a presenter of ideas. It really damaged his credibility in my eyes and made me very skeptical of the rest of his thinking because of this.
It's as if Kent thinks that everybody should adopt his own cultural inheritance of like American consumerism and American intellectualism.
Yes, it's not some bizarre detour, which is how he presents it. And I thought this was just very embarrassing, to be honest. I felt embarrassed for Kent. Or as we were saying earlier, or it's just deliberately one-sided. It's deliberately a kind of character assassination to say, oh, Albert Hofmann can't abide by being the creator of a mere party drug. Instead, he's got to dress it up in this fancy-dancy philosophical BS from European intellectualism. But I believe I'm more or less paraphrasing Kent there, and notice how that is it's treating as baseline Kent's favored definition of what psychedelics are for. He thinks that they're only for partying, and so therefore anything else has to be a dressing it up. And so he accuses Hofmann of doing that, as if Hofmann ever thought that they were just for recreation.
Right. He uses the word disingenuous to describe Albert Hofmann's motivations in this area, as if Albert Hofmann knew that all that LSD was good for was fun and partying and recreation, and that he was resentful and ashamed of that fact for having brought that into the world. And I mean, I think that we're coming to the point of the recording that struck you and I both the strongest, the way he attacks Albert Hofmann. And what stood out to me was his use of the word disingenuous. I thought that was a particularly cruel, unfair characterization of what Albert Hofmann's whole project was about. And I agree with you that it's not as if, neither me nor you are saying that Albert Hofmann is beyond reproach, beyond criticism. And we can agree that his formulation of ideas, the way that he explained psychedelic religion, was not perfectly optimal, and that there's still room for improvement. But James Kent doesn't even address that. He's not even aware of the nuances of the different ways that psychedelia and the connection between psychedelia and religion can be formulated and theorized about. He's much more interested in just trashing somebody else's reputation.
And it's particular. Sorry, to draw the connection, I think tighter. I think what you're getting at is that because Hofmann is trying to advocate that psychedelics be used in a religious context, that they have that there's some cultural goal there. I think maybe that's where, especially, we would disagree with Hofmann, that there's not necessarily a cultural goal of, Hofmann wants the individual's relationship in the Western culture to be healed with nature, and that's very debatable, and from a cultural, like, societal setup point of view. In terms of metaphor, that's, armed with the great analogy interpretation of the Egodeath Theory, I have no problem on one level assenting to that formulation. Sure, that's a formulation of healing, so to speak, the divide between the individual ego, separate self, and the ground of being, or the whole, or the black universe. All that's fine. So all that's fine on a kind of mystic interpretation analogy level. We could probably debate about what that means on a societal level. That's fine. But again, Kent isn't interested in that. Kent is so allergic to the idea of anyone saying that psychedelics should be used in a religious context that, he equates this idea of individualism and healing, or repairing the connection with nature. He thinks that he lumps it in with the Christian concept of original sin, which seemed completely uncalled for to me, considering Albert Hofmann is primarily discussing a neo-Dionysian and very environmentalist type context. And Kent says, oh, that sounds like original sin to me. Well, this seemed uncalled for until I started to think, well, that is one of the primary things that American atheists have an enormous problem with, is the deployment of the concept of original sin in societal life in America. That's one of the things, if you look at atheist discussions and debates and things like that, it is like the concept of original sin is a key point that they dislike and want to argue about. And so what I'm trying to paint here is that Ken is like projecting his own, he's reading his own like hobby horses, his own problems, his own annoyances onto what Hofmann is trying to argue for.
And missing the point of what Hofmann was really saying, what he was really about.
Yes, there's a major interpretive problem that's not just limited to Kent. I think it's really illustrative of these debates. A major interpretive problem of not interpreting. It's a failure to interpret religious statements analogically.
Right. Yes, of course. It's like Albert Hofmann employed a certain metaphor, a healing of the Western entelechy neurosis, but he didn't necessarily understand his own metaphor.
I think that, yes, that's what we would say. Yes. Yes. If I were to sit down and do an analysis of Albert Hofmann, that's what I think we would assert, is he didn't get, he's missing something there, but he's employing a metaphor there. He perhaps doesn't know he is, but he's employing a metaphor for this cybernetic relation between self and hidden controller.
Exactly. As a brief tangent, this exact issue, this exact word applies very strongly to the area of pop psych discourse involved with South American rainforest shamanism and that whole context of use of psychedelic plants, because they always use the word healing and they talk about shamanic healing, that kind of thing, but they never spell out what they mean by healing, because let's face it, they don't know the Egodeath Theory, so they don't really know what they actually mean by healing. And because of that error, you get the tragic cases sometimes of people who have, whether it's advanced cancer or HIV positive, that kind of thing, traveling thousands of miles to the South American rainforest to try to get some healing, even though they're not going to get they might get a kind of healing, but it's not going to be the kind of healing that they maybe have been led to believe. So I think that Kent is referring to that kind of a failure to properly map the word healing to an actual legitimate reference, an actual realistic expectation of what you can get out of psychedelic tripping.
I think you're right. I don't think that's a tangent at all, because I think that that's part of the background of Albert Hofmann becoming interested in visionary plants in culture. I think Ken perceives that as it's part of the turning away from Western culture to shamanic ideas that I think Kent rightfully criticizes, and as we're criticizing here too. This is partly about rhetorical sleight of hand that Kent engages in towards the conclusion, maybe an hour and 20 minutes. So Kent takes Albert Hofmann to task for asserting that LSD is something, a religious sacrament, that in Kent's mind it is not, or not exclusively so. It's not the best definition thereof. But what he accuses Hofmann of doing is saying that it is something, that this is disingenuous, as you pointed out, and that Hofmann is guilty of intellectual dishonesty and of misleading people, because he said that LSD is something that it may not be. But that's not actually a fair portrayal of what Hofmann says, as Kent should know, because Hofmann, of course, knows that it is not exclusively a sacrament, that it, Hofmann recognizes that there was an attempt to, in the 50s and 60s, to use them for medical purposes, and that Hofmann also was acknowledges that people use them in exclusively recreational contexts, or maybe not exclusively, but in recreational contexts, and because Hofmann doesn't like that, he disapproved of Leary and of the American hippie movement, advocating that anyone should just take them in kind of widespread usage. So Hofmann knows that there are other contexts for taking these substances, and Hofmann is clearly not arguing that LSD is exclusively only a sacrament. That's what, but Kent says that, Kent projects that onto him. So this is in fact a disingenuous argument on Kent's part. Hofmann discusses medical applications and recreational use in My Problem Child, which Kent has already referred to. So it's not really that Hofmann is wrong, but more that Kent can't abide by the idea of doing anything religious. Hofmann is making an argument that this would be a good context to perhaps create a certain effect. LSD could be taken in a neo-Dionysian context to affect the healing of individual with nature. He's not saying that it does that at all times, which is how Kent treats him as saying. Kent acts as if Hofmann says that LSD always inevitably produces those results. And he brings up, actually, Albert Hofmann's own reporting of his own experiences don't match up with his stated philosophy. Well, because he's saying that that's a hoped-for state. That's a hoped-for condition, or not condition, a hoped-for set of circumstances in which LSD could be used to perhaps create a certain effect. And Kent turns around and says, Hofmann says that this is what LSD does, but he's wrong, and so he's being intellectually dishonest and dangerous. When I'm trying to hammer on the point here that Hofmann is only saying, well, this is a potential set and setting and a potential effect that I hope LSD could have.
And then Kent is saying that Albert Hofmann is saying that that's the only way that effect could ever happen. That would be the only outcome of taking LSD.
Yes, that it inevitably has that effect, but he's wrong, and so he's being dishonest and disingenuous for saying that. But Kent then indulges in a bit of a kind of righteous indignation that Albert Hofmann was wrong and dangerous, and merely trying to portray himself in a good light as the discoverer of a sacrament, and not he couldn't abide because he was such a elitist European. He couldn't abide by the idea of there being just LSD merely being a recreational drug. This is Kent's projection, not to Hofmann. And so I found all this, rather distasteful and not a character smear and character assassination, a kind of intellectually debasing sort of attack on Albert Hofmann. Again, he may not be worth much. Albert Hofmann may not be worth much time to engage with those ideas of Western entelechy neurosis. That's fine, whatever. But it's I keep trying to bring up here that this tone is really not helpful. It doesn't help move a discussion forward. It doesn't help us, say. I think a more proper response would be, okay, well, I think that Albert Hofmann's ideas have had these effects. I think that they're wrong for X, Y, and Z. Here's how they could be. Better integrated or better understood. But that's not what Ken is interested in. He's a scorched earth style arguer here.
Right. So it's one thing to critically engage with Albert Hofmann's ideas, but it's another thing to try to plant nefarious motivations into Albert Hofmann. And, you speak of distaste. I want to spell out the logic behind James Kent's accusation that Albert Hofmann's whole project of connecting psychedelia to religion is disingenuous, because I think that was the part of the recording that shocked me the most. It really was quite shocking to hear how toxic Kent's attitude towards Albert Hofmann is when he talks about this. So he said that it was all part of a disingenuous attempt to legitimize psychedelic tripping. So Albert Hofmann discovered this drug, and his first hope was, once he realized how potent and how strange and intense the effect was, his first hope was that this would be some kind of wonder drug with some amazing medicinal use. But then LSD became popular thanks to people like Tim Leary, with their loud rhetorical popularization strategies. Millions of people started taking LSD. So it became tarnished by this idea that it's a recreational drug. So Albert Hofmann then decides to falsely and disingenuously fabricate a connection between LSD and religion in his books about Eleusis and books about shamanic cultural use of psychoactive plants. So Kent is saying that Albert Hofmann must have always known that the LSD trip isn't religious. He would have known that because of his own psychotic, unpleasant experiences. And he didn't want to be remembered as a person who just created a drug for a load of hippie dropouts to get high on. So it was all about tendering his own legacy, like managing Albert Hofmann's own legacy in the world after he died, what he would be remembered for. He was horrified by the idea that LSD was just a recreational drug. So he created the idea of LSD as a religious sacrament to salvage his own reputation. That just seems utterly shocking to me. I don't know how Kent can stand there and seriously say that about Albert Hofmann, but it is what it is. And then after that, he seems to suggest that the mystical or transcendent or religious elements of psychedelic experiencing are merely a tiny part among a whole load of other non-mystical hallucinations, like being possessed by demons or seeing mountains and trees breathing, all those kind of things, all those elements of psychedelic experiencing are non-mystical. But then there's this tiny little mystical element that also happens. At one point he says, oh, you might have had hours and hours of tripping, completely non-mystical, and then just in the last 2 minutes of your trip, suddenly it becomes mystical, and you want to focus on those 2 minutes and make out like that was the real part, the really important part of the trip.
Right. I thought it's interesting that he mentioned like that a non-religious or non-mystical aspect of tripping is being possessed by demons.
Right.
Which is, I thought, very funny. Again, I think it reveals that the fallacy we've talked about of equating the unpleasant with the unmystical.
Yes.
As if the concept of being possessed by an otherworldly force is somehow non-religious or non-mystical. Again, he seems to have assumed that that mystical only means the peace and light aspects of experiencing, and perhaps that's a fair criticism that there's too much emphasis on that. Fine, but he completely lacks that. Well, religion has always included the mania, the madness, the frenzy, the death and destruction and dismemberment and terrifying gatekeepers and crucifixion and demon possession. There's always been those elements, hell, etc. There's no, if you actually read pre-modern mystical writings, they are not very pleasant.
All of the big classic religious stories involve, madness and psychotic experiences and terrible pain and that kind of thing. This is a point which James Kent is entirely blind to. He is so stuck on the idea that unpleasant equals unmystical. This is another thing. It fully permeates the whole of his thinking. Actually, the point that you made about peace and light, transcendent, blissful experiences, I think that partly connects to the question that you asked earlier. What actually does James Kent think religion is? And I think that this is part of the answer to that question, that in purely experiential terms, James Kent thinks that religion is just peace and light, blissful, transcendent style experiencing, and absolutely not So, I think that James Kent would probably, if you pressed him on this particular issue, he would say the absolute opposite of the Egodeath Theory, because he would say that the experience of losing control is not a religious experience. I think he would probably say that if you asked him that, like psychotic loss of control, panic attack, that kind of thing. He would directly claim that that's absolutely not religious, which is directly opposing Egodeath Theory.
Absolutely. Yes. It helps. I think it helps by contrast draw into relief that aspect to the Egodeath Theory that's a key. If Kent is right in portraying the contemporary psychedelic movement as being too focused on the peace and light aspects of both tripping and of religion or mysticism or transcendence, if he's right in that, that helps. It again shows the value of understanding psychosis as religious. It shows. I think he may be right in describing the movement as, so to speak, the community as not dealing with that, not incorporating that idea not incorporating the idea of religious psychosis.
But yet he seems to be committing a very similar fallacy to the people who he's accusing then, because he's also not allowing for talk of bad trips to enter into talk of mystical experience. In a similar way, he is diminishing the bad trip experience, which is precisely one of the major criticisms that he has against the pop psych discourse.
Absolutely. That's how we spoke at the beginning of our discussion here. That's how he introduces this episode, that there is psychosis and it's bad. He doesn't make any bones about it. It's bad to have psychosis. If you have sensations, feelings that you don't like, that you can't stop, that are making you fear for your life and your sanity, that's a psychotic episode. Quote here at 650. And in that early part of this episode, these are all bad things, he thinks. He thinks no one should have these. People should not have these experiences. They should avoid them. They should avoid them with low doses, and they should, if they happen to have them, they should seek out therapy. They're bad, bad, bad. No one should have them. Instead, we should only have kind of fun, entertaining experiences.
And don't take it seriously, and don't ever think about it in your normal life. Don't ever let it affect your normal life after the trip finishes.
Yes, it's a shame that you could ever make a decision about your life based upon something you experienced in a psychedelic trip.